In 2013, Memphis, Tennessee, stood as a city of contrasts. Known for its rich cultural history and deep-rooted traditions, it was a place where faith played a significant role in the lives of its residents. Among the most respected figures in the community was Jeremy Brown, a 32-year-old pastor of Faith Horizon Baptist Church. Jeremy was a man admired for his charisma, moral leadership, and unwavering dedication to his congregation. His sermons were powerful and inspiring, often drawing hundreds of worshipers to the church each Sunday. Alongside him was his wife, Tanya Brown, a 30-year-old woman who personified grace and kindness. Together, they appeared to be the embodiment of a strong, faith-centered family. The Browns lived in a modest yet welcoming single-story home in a quiet Memphis suburb. The house was neatly maintained, with a white picket fence surrounding a lush green lawn and a small garden that Tanya tended to on weekends. Inside, the decor was simple but elegant, with warm tones and personal touches that reflected the family's values. Framed photographs lined the walls, showcasing milestones in their life together, birthdays, anniversaries, and family vacations. Bible verses, carefully selected and calligraphed by Tanya, hung in prominent places, reminding everyone who entered of the family's deep faith. Jeremy's days were filled with the responsibilities of leading his church. From counseling troubled members of the congregation to preparing sermons and organizing charity events, his schedule left little room for personal time. He was known for his tireless work ethic, often rising before dawn to ensure everything was in order for the day ahead. To his congregation, he was more than a pastor, he was a mentor, a guide, and a source of unwavering support. Tanya played a complementary role in their shared mission. She was deeply involved in the church's activities, managing volunteer groups, organizing events, and assisting with the children's ministry. She was often seen as the cornerstone of the church's community outreach programs, coordinating food drives, clothing donations, and holiday events for underprivileged families in Memphis. Her kindness and generosity earned her the admiration of many, and she was often referred to as the heart of the church. The Browns' family life revolved around their 2-year-old son, Caleb, a bright and cheerful child who brought joy to everyone he met. Tanya devoted much of her time to caring for Caleb, ensuring he was well-fed, entertained, and loved. She often took him to the local park, read him stories, and sang him to sleep each night. Caleb's laughter echoed through their home, a constant reminder of the happiness they shared as a family. To outsiders, the Browns seemed to have it all: a happy marriage, a thriving church, and a loving family. They were often held up as a model of what a faith-centered life could achieve. Church members would frequently comment on how blessed the Browns were, admiring their unity and dedication to their mission. Jeremy and Tanya were seen as partners in every sense of the word, working together to serve their community and raise their son in a loving, God-fearing household. However, beneath the surface, their lives were not as idyllic as they appeared. Jeremy's dedication to his pastoral duties often left little time for his family. Late nights at the church office, early morning meetings, and constant demands from the congregation created a growing distance between him and Tanya. While Jeremy viewed his work as a calling, Tanya began to feel the weight of managing their home and raising Caleb largely on her own. Her role as the pastor's wife, while fulfilling in some ways, also brought with it a sense of isolation and unspoken pressure to maintain a perfect image. Tanya's days were a delicate balance of responsibilities. She woke early to prepare breakfast for Caleb, manage household chores, and assist with church activities. Despite her outward cheerfulness, there were moments when she felt the strain of her position. The expectations placed on her as both a mother and the pastor's wife were immense, and she often found herself yearning for a deeper connection with Jeremy. While she loved her husband and supported his mission, she couldn't help but feel like she was living in his shadow. The cracks in their seemingly perfect life were subtle but growing. Tanya's once frequent social media posts, filled with pictures of family outings and church events, became sparse. Her vibrant personality, which had once been a source of energy for the church, seemed subdued during community gatherings. Those close to her began to notice her quiet moments of reflection, though she never spoke openly about her struggles. Jeremy, consumed by his work, remained largely unaware of Tanya's feelings. To him, their life was fulfilling and on track. He believed that his efforts at the church were a shared mission, one that he and Tanya were equally invested in. He saw his dedication as a way to secure their family's future and strengthen their faith, not realizing the emotional toll it was taking on his wife. As the months passed, Tanya began seeking small escapes from her routine. She joined a local gym, initially as a way to stay active and relieve stress. The gym became a sanctuary for her, a place where she could step away from the pressures of her role and focus on herself, even if only for an hour or two each day. It was a decision that would unknowingly set the stage for a series of events that would soon shatter the Browns' lives. To the community, the Browns remained the epitome of a faithful, united family. Their smiling faces continued to grace church bulletins, and their home remained a beacon of warmth and hospitality. But beneath the surface, the foundation of their life together was beginning to crack, hidden behind the facade of perfection they worked so hard to maintain. The harmony of their lives in Memphis was fragile, and it was only a matter of time before it would be irreparably broken. On the morning of November 15, 2013, Memphis was cloaked in a light fog, the air cool but not yet harsh with winter's chill. Jeremy Brown rose early, as was his routine. His alarm sounded at 5:30 a.m., and within minutes, he was dressed in running gear and lacing his sneakers. His mornings typically began with a jog through the quiet suburban streets near his home, a ritual he considered essential for both his physical health and his mental clarity. The streets were largely deserted at that hour, save for the occasional early commuter or a neighbor retrieving their newspaper. By 6 a.m., Jeremy had slipped out the front door, careful not to wake his wife Tanya or their 2-year-old son Caleb. The house was silent as he left, a stillness broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of a clock in the living room. Tanya remained upstairs in their bedroom, sound asleep after a restless night. Caleb was in his nursery, tucked under a blanket, his favorite stuffed animal clutched in his tiny hands. To Jeremy, it was an ordinary start to what he anticipated would be another routine day filled with church meetings, counseling sessions, and sermon preparations. He jogged through the neighborhood, following a familiar route, his mind already drifting to the tasks ahead. By 7:15 a.m., Jeremy returned home. He noticed nothing unusual as he approached the house. The front yard was undisturbed, and the neighborhood was as quiet as it had been when he left. He entered through the front door, which he had left unlocked, a common practice in their community. The moment he stepped inside, something felt off. The air in the house seemed heavier, and an unsettling stillness replaced the usual morning sounds of Tanya preparing breakfast or Caleb playing in his crib. Jeremy set down his keys and water bottle on the kitchen counter and called out, but there was no response. As he moved further into the house, his footsteps echoed unnervingly. He walked into the living room and froze. Tanya was lying on the floor, face down, in a pool of blood. The stark crimson stains on the beige carpet contrasted sharply with the soft morning light filtering through the curtains. Her body was motionless, her arms stretched out, and her hair matted with blood. Jeremy's heart raced as he stood paralyzed, his mind struggling to process the scene before him. The scattered remnants of a struggle were evident. A lamp had been knocked over, its shade cracked and lying several feet away. Papers from a drawer were strewn across the floor, along with an overturned chair. On the coffee table, Tanya's phone lay untouched, while her wallet appeared to have been emptied. Jeremy instinctively turned toward the stairs, fearing for Caleb's safety. He sprinted to the nursery, flinging the door open to find his son unharmed, sitting in his crib and crying. Relieved but still panicked, Jeremy quickly checked the rest of the house, confirming that no one else was inside. Jeremy called 911 at 7:19 a.m., his voice shaking as he described what he had found. The dispatcher instructed him to remain on the line while emergency services were dispatched. Minutes later, the wailing sirens of an ambulance and police vehicles shattered the quiet morning as they pulled up to the house. Paramedics rushed inside, finding Jeremy at the foot of the driveway, his hands trembling and his shirt smeared with blood from attempting to check Tanya's pulse. He was visibly distraught, pacing back and forth as he watched the medics work. Inside, Tanya's injuries were assessed. She had been shot 3 times, once in the back, once in the arm, and a fatal shot to the back of the head. Her wounds indicated close-range gunfire, suggesting that her killer had been mere feet away when the shots were fired. Despite her critical condition, Tanya was still faintly breathing when paramedics arrived. She was immediately placed on a stretcher and rushed to the nearest hospital, where a trauma team awaited. Caleb was carried out of the house by a police officer, visibly upset but unharmed. Detectives quickly began surveying the scene. The evidence pointed to a chaotic and violent altercation. Blood spatter patterns indicated that Tanya had been standing when the first shot was fired and had fallen to the ground before the subsequent shots were delivered. Her clothing was partially torn, raising questions about whether she had been physically assaulted before the shooting. The disarray in the living room suggested that the killer had rifled through drawers and cabinets, possibly searching for valuables. However, several high-value items, including electronics, remained untouched, leaving investigators puzzled. The neighbors, alerted by the sirens, began gathering outside, their faces etched with shock and confusion. The Browns were well-liked in the community, and the idea of such a violent crime occurring in their quiet suburb seemed unfathomable. Police officers went door to door, questioning residents about anything unusual they might have seen or heard that morning. A few neighbors reported hearing what they initially thought were distant firecrackers around 6:45 a.m., but no one had suspected foul play at the time. At the hospital, Tanya was rushed into emergency surgery, but her injuries were too severe. By midday, doctors informed Jeremy that Tanya had succumbed to her wounds, and their unborn child, whom Tanya had been carrying for 5 months, could not be saved. The news shattered Jeremy, who had spent the morning clinging to hope that his wife and child might survive. In the span of a few hours, his world had been irrevocably turned upside down. As word of the tragedy spread, the Memphis community was engulfed in grief and disbelief. The Browns were known for their kindness, faith, and generosity, and the idea that someone could commit such an atrocity against them was both shocking and deeply unsettling. Church members gathered at Faith Horizon Baptist Church to pray for the family, lighting candles and offering support to Jeremy and Caleb. For investigators, the questions were immediate and pressing. Who could have done this, and why? The evidence at the scene suggested a possible home invasion, but the lack of forced entry raised suspicions. Jeremy's alibi, confirmed by gym staff and surveillance footage, cleared him of involvement, but the police knew they were racing against time to find the person or persons responsible for the brutal attack. As the first day of the investigation unfolded, the Browns' once idyllic life was now the center of a dark and disturbing mystery, one that would unravel with shocking revelations in the days to come. The police launched their investigation into Tanya Brown's murder with urgency, meticulously combing through the details of the crime scene to unravel what had happened. The first and most striking observation was the absence of any signs of forced entry. The front door was unlocked, a fact that immediately raised suspicions. In the Browns' quiet neighborhood, many residents felt comfortable leaving their doors open during the day, but this detail suggested the attacker may have known this habit or even known the family personally. Inside the house, the scene was chaotic. The living room bore clear evidence of a struggle. Papers and personal belongings were scattered across the floor, a chair was overturned, and a broken lamp lay near the coffee table. Tanya's wallet had been found emptied on the couch. While her identification and miscellaneous papers were left behind, cash and several credit cards were missing. Detectives noted that although the scene initially appeared to suggest a robbery, high-value items such as electronics, jewelry, and other valuables remained untouched. This inconsistency cast doubt on robbery as the sole motive for the attack. As they documented the scene, detectives discovered several unusual pieces of evidence that hinted at the presence of the intruder. On the kitchen counter, they found a sweatshirt draped carelessly over a chair, along with a partially opened pack of cigarettes and a pair of earbuds. Jeremy confirmed that none of these items belonged to him or Tanya. Detectives also noted faint, muddy shoe prints near the entrance, which trailed into the living room. The prints did not match any footwear in the house, indicating they belonged to the perpetrator. These items were carefully collected for forensic analysis as they could hold crucial DNA or fingerprint evidence. The absence of forced entry puzzled investigators further. It suggested that the perpetrator had either entered through the unlocked door unnoticed or had prior knowledge of the family's habits. This led detectives to suspect that the crime might not have been random. To explore this possibility, they began looking into Tanya's personal life, hoping to identify any potential connections that could explain the violence. The first major breakthrough came from Tanya's phone. Detectives found a series of text messages from an unknown number that stood out among her recent communications. The messages were personal, even intimate, and their tone suggested a relationship beyond casual acquaintance. The number was traced to a prepaid phone, which made it impossible to identify the sender immediately. The messages hinted at secrecy, and detectives began to consider the possibility that Tanya had been involved in a romantic relationship outside her marriage. This revelation, while still unconfirmed, became a critical lead in the investigation. Jeremy, as Tanya's husband and the person who discovered her body, was the immediate focus of initial suspicion. However, his alibi was quickly corroborated. Jeremy explained that he had left the house early that morning for his usual jog around the neighborhood. Witnesses in the area confirmed seeing him running at the times he described, and data from his fitness tracker backed up his account. Additionally, security cameras from a nearby cafe captured him entering the establishment shortly after his run, where he stopped briefly before returning home. With this evidence, detectives were able to rule Jeremy out as a suspect. As the investigation continued, more details began to emerge. Tanya's stolen credit cards had been used within hours of her death. Transactions were attempted at an ATM and a nearby gas station. Surveillance footage from these locations showed a man in a hoodie and gloves attempting to withdraw money using Tanya's cards. While his face was partially obscured, detectives believed they could enhance the footage to provide a clearer image. The vehicle seen in the footage, a dark-colored sedan, matched the description of a car spotted by a neighbor near the Browns' home around the time of the murder. This connection added weight to the theory that the perpetrator was the same individual using Tanya's stolen cards. As forensic analysis of the physical evidence began, detectives remained focused on the text messages found on Tanya's phone. They theorized that the unknown sender might have had a motive related to the crime, whether it was jealousy, anger, or a desire to keep their connection with Tanya hidden. The muddy shoe prints, the sweatshirt, and the other items left behind in the house were sent to the lab for testing, with hopes that they would yield DNA or other identifying evidence. The pieces of the case began to take shape, but many questions still lingered. Who was the sender of the messages on Tanya's phone? Was the murder premeditated, or had it escalated from a robbery gone wrong? And how did the perpetrator gain access to the Browns' home without raising suspicion? These unanswered questions left detectives determined to dig deeper into Tanya's life and relationships. While the investigation remained in its early stages, it was becoming increasingly clear that this was no random act of violence, but a crime rooted in something far more personal. The investigation into Tanya Brown's murder took a significant turn when detectives reviewed surveillance footage from the neighborhood. One of the cameras, located 2 houses down from the Browns' residence, captured critical evidence. At approximately 6:45 a.m. on November 15th, a dark-colored sedan pulled into the Browns' driveway. The footage showed 3 men exiting the vehicle. Although the quality of the video was grainy, the men appeared to linger near the front door before entering the house. Less than 20 minutes later, the same men were seen rushing back to the car and speeding away. This timeline aligned with the estimated time of Tanya's death, making these individuals key suspects. Detectives focused their efforts on identifying the vehicle and the men seen in the footage. A breakthrough came when a patrol officer recognized the sedan as matching the description of a car involved in a string of robberies earlier that month. The car, abandoned in a parking lot later that evening, was recovered and processed for evidence. Inside, investigators found additional stolen items, including purses, electronics, and a wallet belonging to a victim of another home invasion. DNA evidence collected from the vehicle matched one of the men from the surveillance footage, leading to the identification of 24-year-old Jay Harris. Jay Harris was no stranger to law enforcement. His criminal history included multiple convictions for burglary, theft, and possession of stolen property. Recently released on parole, Harris had been under loose supervision but had clearly returned to a life of crime. Detectives wasted no time apprehending him. Harris was arrested at a relative's home 2 days after Tanya's murder. During the initial search of his residence, police found several items that matched descriptions of stolen property from the Browns' home, including one of Tanya's missing credit cards. Harris was brought in for questioning, and what began as an interrogation about robbery soon revealed a deeper, more personal connection to Tanya. Detectives confronted Harris with evidence from Tanya's phone, including the text messages she had received from the unidentified number. When pressed, Harris admitted that the phone belonged to him. This revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation, as it confirmed that Harris was not merely a random intruder but someone who had been in contact with Tanya prior to her death. Further digging into Harris's background uncovered how he and Tanya had met. According to witnesses and phone records, Tanya had first crossed paths with Harris at a fitness gym she frequented. Feeling increasingly isolated in her marriage, Tanya had sought solace outside of her home. Her interactions with Harris initially seemed harmless, friendly conversations during workouts and occasional advice about fitness routines. However, as detectives pieced together the timeline, it became clear that their relationship had evolved into something far more intimate. Phone records indicated that Tanya and Harris had been communicating for several months before her death. The messages exchanged between them ranged from casual to deeply personal, painting a picture of a clandestine relationship that Tanya had hidden from everyone around her. While the exact nature of their affair remained unclear, detectives found messages from Harris that suggested he had begun to pressure Tanya for money. In one particularly alarming text, Harris threatened to reveal their relationship to her husband, Jeremy, if she did not comply with his demands. This discovery provided a potential motive for Harris's involvement in the events leading up to Tanya's murder. As investigators delved deeper into Harris's activities, they began to suspect that the robbery at the Browns' home was not entirely random. Harris's knowledge of Tanya's routines, coupled with the unlocked door, suggested premeditation. It appeared that Harris and his accomplices had specifically targeted the Browns' residence, likely believing it would be an easy opportunity to steal valuables and extort Tanya. However, something had clearly gone wrong. Whether Harris had planned for violence or whether the situation had escalated unexpectedly remained a central question for detectives. Harris's connection to Tanya not only complicated the investigation but also shed light on the psychological and emotional aspects of the case. Tanya's feelings of loneliness and disconnection in her marriage had made her vulnerable, leading her to seek companionship in someone like Harris. Detectives theorized that her attempts to distance herself from Harris and his growing demands might have triggered the events that culminated in her death. Harris's threats to expose their relationship added an element of desperation to his actions, suggesting that the robbery may have been a cover for something far more personal and malicious. As Harris continued to cooperate with investigators, he provided the names of the 2 other men involved in the robbery. Both were known associates with similar criminal backgrounds, but their specific roles in the murder remained unclear. What was certain, however, was that Harris's relationship with Tanya had placed her in a precarious position, ultimately leading to the tragic events of November 15th. With Harris in custody and his connection to Tanya established, detectives turned their attention to his accomplices, hoping to uncover the full scope of their involvement in the crime. The case, once thought to be a straightforward robbery, now revealed itself to be a tangled web of betrayal, manipulation, and violence. As the investigation progressed, detectives began piecing together the full story of Tanya Brown's murder. Jay Harris, under mounting pressure from the overwhelming evidence against him, admitted during questioning that he had not acted alone. He named 2 accomplices, Lamont Carter, 27, and Ray Wilson, 22, both of whom had extensive criminal histories. According to Harris, the 3 men had conspired to rob Tanya and use her secret relationship with him as leverage for financial gain. Lamont Carter was known to police as a repeat offender with a reputation for violence. His criminal record included armed robbery, assault, and drug possession. Ray Wilson, the youngest of the group, had a history of petty thefts and burglaries but had recently escalated his activities by associating with more dangerous individuals like Carter. Together, the three men formed a loose criminal network, preying on vulnerable targets for quick financial gain. Harris explained that the plan to target Tanya had been his idea. Over the months of their clandestine relationship, he had become familiar with her routines and vulnerabilities. He knew that Tanya felt isolated in her marriage to Jeremy, a respected pastor, and that she feared the repercussions of her affair being exposed. Harris had initially used this knowledge to demand money from her through veiled threats, but when Tanya began to distance herself and refused his demands, he turned to Carter and Wilson to help escalate the situation. The plan was to confront Tanya, take whatever valuables they could, and intimidate her into giving them more money in the future. On the morning of November 15th, Harris, Carter, and Wilson arrived at the Browns' home in a stolen dark-colored sedan. Harris knew that Jeremy had left for his morning run and that Tanya would likely be alone with the front door unlocked, as it often was. Surveillance footage from a neighbor's security camera confirmed the timeline, showing the sedan pulling into the Browns' driveway at approximately 6:45 a.m. The three men entered the house through the unlocked door, with Harris leading the way. Inside, Tanya was caught off guard but immediately recognized Harris. Her initial shock turned to defiance as the men began demanding money and valuables. She refused to comply, knowing that Harris already had access to some of her financial information but determined not to let him exploit her further. Detectives later theorized that Tanya's resistance was driven not only by fear but also by anger at Harris's betrayal and manipulation. As the confrontation escalated, Lamont Carter grew increasingly agitated. Harris described Carter as someone who thrived on intimidation and violence, and that morning was no exception. Carter began shouting at Tanya, threatening her with a small-caliber handgun he had brought with him. When Tanya still refused to cooperate, a physical struggle ensued. Harris claimed that he tried to de-escalate the situation, but Carter, enraged by Tanya's defiance, acted impulsively. He fired 3 shots at close range, hitting Tanya in the back, arm, and head. The fatal shot to her head ended the struggle instantly. Harris recounted that the moment Tanya collapsed to the floor, he panicked. He had not anticipated the situation escalating to murder and was visibly shaken by what had just occurred. Carter, however, remained unfazed and began ransacking the living room for valuables. Ray Wilson, who had been standing by nervously during the confrontation, joined Carter in searching for anything they could take. The men found Tanya's wallet and removed her credit cards and cash, but left behind larger items like electronics, likely due to time constraints and fear of being caught. Harris claimed that he could not bring himself to stay in the house after witnessing Tanya's death. He fled to the car, urging the others to hurry. The 3 men left the scene just before 7:05 a.m., as confirmed by the surveillance footage showing the sedan speeding away from the Browns' driveway. Their departure was frantic, and they left behind crucial evidence, including the sweatshirt and earbuds later recovered by detectives. After leaving the Browns' home, the group attempted to use Tanya's stolen credit cards at a nearby ATM and gas station. Surveillance footage from these locations showed Harris trying to withdraw money while Wilson stood by as a lookout. Carter remained in the car, which they eventually abandoned in a parking lot to avoid detection. The failed ATM transactions and the abandoned vehicle would later provide investigators with the evidence needed to link all 3 men to the crime. Detectives now had a clearer picture of the events leading to Tanya's death. What had initially appeared to be a random home invasion had, in fact, been a calculated act rooted in betrayal and greed. Harris's relationship with Tanya had made her a target, and his decision to involve Carter and Wilson had turned what might have been a manipulative scheme into a deadly confrontation. Tanya's resistance and Carter's violent tendencies had escalated the situation to murder, leaving Harris and his accomplices scrambling to cover their tracks. With Harris's confession and the identification of Carter and Wilson, detectives moved quickly to locate and arrest the 2 remaining suspects. Both men were apprehended within days, each found hiding out in different parts of the city. During their arrests, police recovered additional stolen items and the handgun used in the murder, further solidifying the case against them. The unraveling of the trio's plan exposed the dangerous intersection of personal betrayal and criminal intent. Tanya's relationship with Harris, born out of loneliness and vulnerability, had ultimately placed her in harm's way. The involvement of Carter and Wilson, both driven by desperation and greed, had turned a flawed scheme into a tragic loss of life. As the investigation transitioned to the prosecution phase, the full extent of their actions would come to light, ensuring that all three men would face justice for their roles in the murder of Tanya Brown. The trial of Lamont Carter, Jay Harris, and Ray Wilson drew significant public attention as it unfolded in the Memphis courthouse. The case, rooted in betrayal, manipulation, and brutal violence, captivated the community that had once admired Tanya Brown as a dedicated wife and mother. As details of the crime came to light during the proceedings, the courtroom became a battleground of evidence, testimony, and emotional turmoil. Jay Harris, the first of the three to face charges, opted to cooperate with prosecutors. In exchange for a reduced sentence, Harris agreed to a plea deal that required him to provide a full account of the events leading to Tanya's murder. During his testimony, Harris admitted to initiating the plan to rob Tanya and leveraging their secret relationship to intimidate her. He detailed how he had enlisted Lamont Carter and Ray Wilson to assist him, fully aware of Carter's violent tendencies. Harris described the moments leading up to Tanya's death, explaining that he never intended for the confrontation to escalate into murder but placed the blame squarely on Carter for pulling the trigger. Harris's cooperation proved invaluable to the prosecution, as his testimony not only implicated Carter and Wilson but also aligned with the forensic evidence and surveillance footage. However, his admission of manipulating Tanya and exploiting her vulnerability painted him as a deeply flawed and calculating individual. Despite his cooperation, Harris faced intense scrutiny from both the prosecution and the public, who saw his actions as a betrayal of trust and humanity. Lamont Carter, the central figure in the case, vehemently denied his involvement in Tanya's murder. Throughout the trial, Carter maintained his innocence, claiming he had no intention of harming Tanya and that Harris's testimony was fabricated to shift the blame. However, the evidence against him was overwhelming. Fingerprints matching Carter's were found on the broken lamp and other objects at the crime scene, and his DNA was recovered from the sweatshirt left behind in the Browns' home. Surveillance footage captured his presence at the ATM and gas station, further linking him to the crime. The handgun used to kill Tanya, recovered during his arrest, was confirmed through ballistic analysis to be the murder weapon. The prosecution presented a compelling case, arguing that Carter's violent tendencies and inability to control his temper directly led to Tanya's death. Witnesses testified to Carter's history of aggression, including prior incidents where he had used a firearm to intimidate others. The emotional testimony from Tanya's family and friends further reinforced the devastating impact of Carter's actions. As the trial progressed, it became clear that his denial of responsibility would not hold up against the mountain of evidence. Ray Wilson, the youngest of the trio, took a different approach during his trial. Acknowledging his role as an accomplice, Wilson expressed remorse for his involvement and claimed he had been coerced by Carter and Harris. While his legal team argued that Wilson had not directly participated in the violence, the prosecution emphasized his active role in the planning and execution of the robbery. Wilson's fingerprints were found on Tanya's wallet, and surveillance footage showed him standing as a lookout during the ATM transactions. His actions, though less direct than Carter's, were instrumental in the crime. The courtroom was a tense and emotionally charged environment throughout the proceedings. Tanya's husband, Jeremy Brown, attended every session, often accompanied by members of his congregation and family. His presence served as a reminder of the personal devastation caused by the crime. Despite his deep grief and anger, Jeremy maintained a composed demeanor, embodying the principles of forgiveness and faith that he had preached for years. At one point during the trial, Jeremy addressed the court, speaking about the pain of losing his wife and the betrayal he felt upon learning of her secret relationship. His words resonated deeply as he grappled with the complex emotions of love, loss, and forgiveness. Outside the courtroom, the trial sparked widespread debate and media coverage. Many in the community expressed outrage at the senselessness of the crime and the betrayal of trust that led to it. Others focused on the broader issues of violence, systemic failures, and the vulnerabilities that allowed Tanya to become a target. The case highlighted the intersection of personal choices and societal pressures, prompting discussions about justice, morality, and redemption. In the end, the verdicts reflected the varying degrees of culpability among the three defendants. Lamont Carter, as the one who pulled the trigger, was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge cited the brutality of the crime and Carter's lack of remorse as reasons for the harsh sentence. Jay Harris, despite his cooperation, received a 20-year sentence for his role in orchestrating the robbery and manipulating Tanya. His plea deal spared him from a harsher penalty but did not absolve him of responsibility. Ray Wilson, acknowledging his lesser but still significant involvement, was sentenced to 15 years, with the possibility of parole after 10. The conclusion of the trial marked the end of a long and painful chapter for Tanya's family and the Memphis community. While justice was served in the eyes of the law, the emotional scars left by the crime would take far longer to heal. For Jeremy and those who knew Tanya, the trial brought some closure but also underscored the fragility of trust and the far-reaching consequences of betrayal. The courtroom quieted as the sentences were read, but the impact of the case would linger, serving as a somber reminder of the lives forever changed by a single morning's actions. After the trial concluded, Jeremy Brown found himself standing at the crossroads of grief and rebuilding. The verdicts had brought justice to his wife Tanya and offered some closure, but the emotional weight of the events lingered heavily. Jeremy knew that the life he once shared with Tanya was gone forever, and now his focus had to shift to finding a way forward, for himself, for their son Caleb, and for the community that still looked to him for guidance. He remained in Memphis, determined to continue his pastoral work, though his mission now carried a new and deeper purpose. Jeremy's return to the pulpit was not easy. The church, which had once been a place of joy and celebration for him and Tanya, now felt like a reminder of all he had lost. Yet he recognized the responsibility he bore to his congregation, many of whom had stood by him during the darkest moments of his life. Slowly, he began to reshape his sermons, infusing them with themes of pain, forgiveness, and the resilience of faith. He spoke openly about his own struggles, sharing how he had wrestled with anger, sorrow, and the sense of betrayal. His honesty resonated deeply with his congregation, many of whom had their own burdens to bear. Jeremy became a living testament to the power of faith in the face of unimaginable loss. In his messages, Jeremy emphasized the importance of forgiveness. He told his congregation that forgiveness was not about condoning the actions of others, but about freeing oneself from the chains of bitterness and hatred. He admitted that forgiving Tanya for her hidden relationship and forgiving her killers was the hardest thing he had ever done, but it was also the only way he could begin to heal. Through his example, he encouraged others to confront their own pain and find the strength to let go of resentment. His vulnerability and openness gave new life to his ministry, attracting both old and new members to the church who were drawn to his message of hope. Beyond the church, Jeremy dedicated himself to being a father to Caleb. The 2-year-old, now the center of Jeremy's world, became his primary source of motivation. Jeremy took on the dual roles of father and mother, striving to create a stable and loving environment for Caleb despite the void left by Tanya's absence. He adjusted his schedule to spend more time with his son, from making breakfast in the mornings to reading bedtime stories at night. Jeremy wanted Caleb to grow up knowing not only the depth of his mother's love, but also the strength of the family that remained. He worked tirelessly to shield Caleb from the shadows of the tragedy while ensuring that Tanya's memory remained a positive and enduring presence in their lives. As time went on, Jeremy channeled his pain into action. He founded a charitable organization in Tanya's memory, focusing on helping women who faced challenges similar to those Tanya had endured. The foundation provided support to women experiencing domestic struggles, financial manipulation, or emotional blackmail. Jeremy partnered with counselors, legal experts, and community leaders to offer resources and safe spaces for those in need. The organization quickly gained recognition, and its outreach programs began making a tangible difference in the lives of many. For Jeremy, the foundation was more than a tribute to Tanya. It was a way to ensure that her story could help others find strength and protection. The foundation also became an outlet for Jeremy's grief. Through its work, he felt connected to Tanya's compassionate spirit and her desire to help others. He saw the organization as a continuation of her legacy, a way to transform the pain of her loss into something meaningful and enduring. At the same time, it gave him a renewed sense of purpose, reminding him that even in the face of tragedy, there was still good to be done in the world.